Hello, thank you for joining us. This is Jocelyn Durkay with the National Conference of State Legislatures. We're going to wait just a minute to see if other attendees join the line before we begin. Thank you. Hello, and thank you for joining us for the National Conference of State Legislatures webinar, State Forestry Policies for Carbon Benefits. Today's webinar is hosted by NCSL's Environment, Energy, and Transportation Group. My name is Jocelyn Durkay, and I am the Energy Policy Specialist at NCSL. I will be moderating today's webinar, which will address the current landscape of forests, the role of forests in sequestering carbon, and highlight policy opportunities in state action. This webinar is part of a suite of items NCSL has developed on the role of forests in carbon storage and sequestration. Please visit ncsl.org/research/energy for more resources. Before we begin, I want to mention that the webinar is being recorded, and registrants will be able to access a recording of the webinar and presentation slides on NCSL's website. We will send out a notice shortly with a link to these resources. If you would like to download a copy of today's slides immediately, please expand the Handouts tab on your control panel to access copies of our presenters' slides. Our speakers today are Jay Ferrel, the Executive Director of the National Association of State Foresters, Jad Daly, Director of the Trust for Public Lands Climate and Conservation Program, and Rita Height, Executive Vice President of the American Tree Farm System, Woodlands, and Policy at the American Forest Foundation. Our presenters will be answering questions throughout the webinar with an extended question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Please type your questions into the question box on the right side of your screen at any time during the webinar. With that, we're fortunate to have Jay Ferrel as our first speaker. Jay Ferrel is the Executive Director of the National Association of State Foresters based in Washington, D.C. NASF is a nonprofit organization comprised of forestry agency directors representing all 50 states, U.S. territories, and the District of Columbia. Prior to joining NASF, Jay was the Manager of Field Operations for the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, which is North America's largest forest certification program. His prior experience also includes serving as a forest policy specialist with the American Forest and Paper Association and as a state forester. Without further delay, we welcome Jay.
Thank you for the opportunity to share some perspectives from the state forestry agencies on today's webinar. Today I will begin with a brief overview of the NASF and our policy positions related to carbon. Second, I will describe the role of state foresters and forest action plans in delivering a wide array of public benefits derived from trees and forests. Third, I will focus on forestry fundamentals, the actions and infrastructure needed to enhance all public benefits, including carbon. And finally, I will end with a few key conclusions. The National Association of State Foresters' mission is closely aligned with NCSL in that we are strong advocates for state interests at the national level. Our members work for the governors and state legislatures and are among the nation's foremost experts on natural resource issues. NASF's work focuses in the three areas of policy, communications, and partnerships, and I'm pleased that Jad Daly and Rita Height are great partners of NASF. Our members are state foresters, and their perspectives reflect the diversity of the states. This is a real strength when we come together to speak with one voice. Diversity also means we may not always be able to take positions or support partners on certain issues. Resolutions are the strongest public statements NASF can make because they are positions on issues passed by member consensus at our annual meeting. Green Building Resolution 2013-1 and Climate Change Resolution 2015-3 are related to today's carbon topic. These resolutions share common themes with other NASF resolutions. We promote active forest management, urban trees, wood products, forest markets, favorable tax policy, and reliable measurement through the U.S. Forest Service Inventory and Analysis, FIA program. These are solutions to the ultimate challenge, which is keeping forests as forests. Many public benefits, including carbon, flow from meeting this one objective. The assets, services, and programs provided by state forestry agencies represent the critical fundamental infrastructure needed to produce the wide range of public benefits derived from forests. State-owned forests and tree seedling nurseries are assets that maintain and regenerate forests. Professional landowner assistance and wildfire suppression are key services since most of the nation's forests are privately owned. Best management practices or BMP programs produce environmental benefits while supporting the social and economic benefits derived from timber harvesting. And FIA, the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, is the nation's forest census. EQIP, or the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, assists family forest owners manage their forests. And state forestry agencies are essential in delivering these and many other programs. Every state, U.S. territory, and the District of Columbia has a forest action plan. Collectively, these state-specific priorities and strategies represent a powerful strategic plan for the nation's forests. They help target limited resources where they are needed most. NASF advocates that Congress and federal agencies use these state-defined tools rather than one-size-fits-all approaches to direct funding and policy decisions. National support for state-specific strategies is essential. The best management practices or BMP programs administered by states are among the nation's best environmental success stories. Each state takes a different approach to meeting Federal Clean Water Act requirements, and each program works in different ways, and the EPA has long held that they all work. State-based BMP programs and forest action plans are good models when considering other national approaches to issues such as carbon. State flexibility is key. As an example, Arizona's Forest Action Plan references actions that can be taken to produce carbon benefits. Forest management activities such as thinning reduce wildfire risk, increase growth rates, and produce carbon benefits as well as a variety of other benefits. The Forest Action Plan can target where investments in these activities are most needed and will produce the most benefits. Although carbon is a complex topic, it is worth considering some basic fundamentals related to trees and forests. Trees, forests, and wood products store carbon. Trees take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen, while wildfires release carbon. Forest management activities such as thinning enhance carbon benefits and reduce fire threats. And forest management cannot occur without wood products markets. The same actions we take to enhance carbon benefits can also enhance public safety through reduced fire risk, enhance public health through healthy forests producing clean air and water, and enhance the quality of our lives by producing the jobs and products we depend on every day. The key is to keep forests as forests and keep working forests working. To do that, we must understand landowner needs. Most of the nation's forests are privately owned. These forests may be lost to permanent development. Family forest owners need incentives and professional assistance to manage and keep forests as forests. Public forests won't be sold off, but they can be lost and are being lost to fire, insects, and disease. Solutions that remove policy and budget barriers to active management are needed for public forests. This is another Forest Action Plan example. Every state in the South identifies forest conversion, fragmentation, and parcelization as significant threats. Again, most of the forest land in the South is privately owned. Forest action plans identify access to forest products markets and economic incentives as key solutions. This is because landowners need the financial and operational ability to manage and retain their forests. State Forestry Agency professionals serve an important role in advising landowners of market options and various sources of financial and technical assistance. Whether it's producing carbon or the many other benefits derived from forests, this list represents areas of focus that offer a great return on investment. Active forest management, thinning, timber harvesting, and tree planting, early detection and rapid response to insects, disease, and fire, maintaining urban tree canopy, encouraging diverse forest products markets, and maintaining the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, which is the nation's forest census. FIA captures key sustainability measures, informs policymakers, and helps drive industry investment. Again, state forestry agencies provide the fundamental infrastructure that is so essential for the forest management and protection activities needed on both public and private land. Forest products markets enable forest management and fuels reduction activities to occur and support long-term forest retention. Diverse markets provide landowners with more management options. So in conclusion, by focusing on the fundamentals that enhance forest resilience and retention, we enhance carbon and every other benefit derived from forests. Enhancing support for state forestry agencies enhances the essential infrastructure needed to accomplish everything from tree planting to fire protection. Any national policy must support state flexibility. BMP programs offer a model approach for carbon. State forest action plans are a powerful tool for targeting limited resources where they are needed most. And finally, target solutions to the unique differences between private and public lands. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you very much, Shay. That was very informative. We're going to turn to our audience now. We're going to be uploading a poll asking where our attendees are coming from, which will help shape our discussion later on in this webinar. So that will be appearing on your screen in just 1 second. Please go ahead and take a second to vote, and then we will be sharing the results. So we have over 90% of folks who voted. We'll leave it open for just 1 second. Thank you. We're going to share the results of the poll right now. As you can see, we have a majority of folks from the north or northeast and the south or southeast. Thank you very much for participating. Now that we have a gauge on our audience, we're going to be moving to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Jad Daly. He is the director of the Trust for Public Lands Climate Conservation Program, which he founded and has led since its inception. Jad coordinates the Trust for Public Lands development of the Climate Smart Cities Partnership with municipal governments and carbon mitigation work. Jad also leads the Trust for Public Lands climate policy efforts, including his service as an appointee to the Federal Landscape Conservation Cooperative National Council and his leadership of the Forest Climate Working Group which he co-founded. All right, Jad, we're going to get your slides queued up right now, and please go ahead.
Great, thanks so much. As the cover slide indicates, we really do think that forests are a wonderfully convenient solution for climate challenges because they bring so many co-benefits, beautiful scenery like this, but water supplies and forest-based economic development and so many other things that we all care about. The next slide, please. So, Jay's folks at the National Association of State Foresters are really the best friend a landowner could have. Jay described all these fabulous tools and types of expertise that state foresters have, which are to help landowners puzzle through the many kind of competing management considerations and outcomes that they're seeking. And so, what I want to talk about, so I think Jay did a really great job of kind of setting that baseline of some of the issues that forest landowners are grappling with around the country and things they're trying to accomplish and some of the tools that we have in place to help landowners. What I want to talk about is how does climate change, that new green thought bubble there, how does that shuffle the deck a little bit for private landowners and I should also say for public land managers as well. The next slide, please. So to answer that question, about almost 8 years ago now, our organization, the Trust for Public Land, and Rita Height's organization, the American Forest Foundation, brought together leaders from across the forest community. National Association of State Foresters was one of the first groups at the table, the U.S. Forest Service as an ex officio partner, and then all sort of manner of private sector interests, forest products industry and forest products manufacturing, folks, a wide range of conservation organizations, groups working carbon markets, academic experts, really all the different entities that are working in the forest sector. And we brought everyone together to ask the fundamental question, how do forests relate to this challenge of climate change, and what are the policy measures that we might include going forward that can help us capture what we think forests have to contribute as a climate solution. Next slide, please. And we think that the most important, the core of the story is really about the essential role that forests play in sequestering and storing carbon. And on an annual basis, about 13%, plus or minus a percent these days from year to year. But for U.S. forests capture about 13% of our carbon emissions. And to give you a sense of scale, the U.S. EPA Clean Power Plan, which has gotten a lot of attention as a major carbon reduction strategy, well, by the time it's fully ramped up in 2030, it will accomplish not quite as much carbon reduction as we're getting right now out of our forests. So this isn't a rounding error in the climate equation. U.S. forests are a huge piece of the puzzle. And so the question that we've been grappling with as a group, the sort of first question we've been grappling with, how can we maintain that really important carbon sink and then potentially even grow it? Next slide, please. And the data suggests that that we can't rest on our laurels. That we've been in kind of a halcyon age of forest growth in the United States in recent decades. And the neat thing is that that's with great productivity from the forest products industry. So that's not just sitting back and watching forests grow, but we've been really effectively and sustainably managing forests for a wide range of uses, including forest products, and yet still getting really strong overall forest growth in the country. But some of the trends that are starting to emerge are threatening to level off our overall forest stock and ultimately see some declines. And a couple of those trends are urbanization, which could, as Jay offered some statistics earlier, consume tens of millions of acres of private forest land in the decades to come, and then rising stressors that we're seeing, things like super intensive wildfire, particularly in the West, that are having and not just a short-term, but in some cases even a long-term impact on the health and productivity of our forests. Next slide. And so to kind of net that out for you so you can understand how the Forest Service is projecting the trends overall, if you follow the line across the very bottom, essentially, which is the total forest sector carbon, so a combination of carbon that's captured in our existing forests, addition to the forest land base from new forests that are being, in some cases, restored, or in other cases, old pasture land that's returning to forest, for example, minus forests that are developed. When you add all that together right now, you see, and also wood products, I should mention, the carbon that's sequestered in long-lived wood products. When you add all that together, right now we're at 142 teragrams of carbon per year, and you can see that, or excuse me, 144. And as you can see, that's going to go up for a little while longer. But then some of those trends that I mentioned, things like intensive urbanization, if those trends continue, we'll start to erode that carbon sequestration that we're seeing now, and eventually drive it down below these levels that we're getting right now. So that means we're going to have to, if that were to occur, of course, that means we'd have to find other even greater carbon reductions from other sectors than what we're already trying to accomplish. So clearly, we can't afford to go backwards in an area like this, and we think that there are a lot of great things that can happen for the public interest and for forests if we can actually change some of those trends and keep that positive growth in forest carbon going forward. Next slide, please. And so one of the other things to consider, back to the picture with the landowner with all the thought bubbles around that landowner, is that climate change is really shuffling the deck a little bit on forest management. And it's things like the types of species, tree species that thrive in a particular area, that's changing. Pressures from pest infestations are intensifying. All of that is combined with more intense storms that we're seeing in the southeast in particular. There have been some tremendous forest loss from things like hurricanes, and then I mentioned fire already. And then it really gets tricky when some of these things start to interact with each other. So, example, a forest that might be weakened by species range shifts, that's going to make the forest less resilient to something like storm damage. And so, landowners need information about these changes and are going to really need tools to be able to manage their forest adaptively, through these kinds of challenges. And next slide, please. And then one other thing to consider is I've spoken about forest products, and just to give you an example of how much that means to our economy. In 2012, forest products industry, $238 billion worth of forest products that we generated, a pretty remarkable number. It's a really critical component of our economy, and so that's one of the things we have to think about. It's not just thinking about carbon, but it's how do we grow carbon while continuing to sustain this really important economic activity. But then there's some of the other benefits that we get from forests, which are not always monetized. Things like the source water protection that we get from our forests. More than half of U.S. drinking water originates in a forested watershed, and so those forests upstream of our communities are playing a really critical role. That if those forests are compromised by climate change and some of the stressors that I just described, we've seen examples around the country, again, particularly in the West, where things like very, very intensive forest fires had a very direct impact then on drinking water supplies and our reservoirs and other drinking water infrastructure. So as we think about management strategies going forward, those kinds of other public values that we're getting out of forest, we need to factor those into our strategies as well, and the kinds of tools that we're providing to landowners to manage forests into the future. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to turn it over to Rita Height, but I believe, Jocelyn, you had you're going to take some questions from the group.
Yes, thank you very much, Chad, for your presentation. As a reminder for our audience, please continue to send in your questions through the question box. We do have one here, and you did touch on this a bit, Chad, and then given our audience survey, is there information around environmental changes or forest impacts that are affecting different regions of the country differently, or essentially is one region of the country experiencing impacts more than others?
That's a really great question, and it underscores what, for the Forest Climate Working Group, has been one of our most important messages to policymakers, which is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution for managing forests in the face of the kinds of challenges that we're talking about. It is a very regional set of policy. It's the same set of policy questions, but the way that you answer them really has to be fine-tuned to the regional nuances of different forest types, different climatic regimes, and other factors as well. Things like the types of forest products that are predominant that we're producing in different forested regions of the country. So we really do need a kind of a national understanding of what has to happen, but then we have to use science and a deep understanding of the forest sector at a regional basis to fine-tune policy approaches that really fit locally. And I think there's some great examples of that. I should point to the state foresters working with the Forest Service, and a lot of different folks from the private sector have been part of these what have been called climate change response frameworks that have been developed regionally, and basically they're partnerships to pull together the science that landowners need that translates to those specific regional differences in geographies. And so these collaborations have been organized essentially by kind of forested subregion, and I think that's just one small example of what success looks like when we create structures that sort of fit the diversity of forest types around the country.
Great, thank you. And we did have one other question come in that wanted to address it. The question is, how well are forests being managed regarding the impact of different pests, whether it's invasive species or otherwise?
It seems from my perspective, and actually I'd love to let Jay and Rita chime in on this as well, but I feel like the forest sector has mounted a rather remarkable response in the face of, for example, the mountain pine beetle has been a rather remarkable scale of impact, and it seems as though the forest sector has done a great job of adapting in terms of thinking about how to adapt some of the forest products that we're deriving from some of those forests, and help landowners rally response. So I think there's some great examples of success, but I'd love to let Rita or Jay speak about some of the successes, challenges that they've seen in that regard.
I'm happy to jump in here and talk. This is Rita Height with the American Forest Foundation. I think Jad's right. There have been some great successes around that, but it kind of goes back to Jay's initial point about having the tools and support for private landowners to help them actively manage their land. Because with those tools and support, landowners are better able to have resilient forests that can withstand some of those insect and disease pressures. And I believe at this point, I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50 million acres of forest all across the country, public and private lands, that are at high risk of insect and disease infestation. So the problem is, I think we've got a lot of tools, but there's a big scale of an issue out there, and that's why it's so important to provide those landowners, especially with the tools and resources they need to tackle the problem.
And this is Jay Ferrel with the National Association of State Foresters. Jad and Rita answered that question very well, and the only thing I would add is that from the publicly owned land sector, and Rita really hit on it too in terms of just the scale of the problem. We're not even close into addressing the true nature and scale of the forest health challenges out there on public land, and that goes for state-owned forests as well as federally owned forests, and that is just because of the diverse expectations of the public for how those forests should be managed, and in particular on national forests, a lot of the political barriers related to timber harvesting, which is really the fundamental tool for addressing some of these problems.
Great, thank you all for your responses. So with that, we'll begin with our final speaker today, who is Rita Height. Rita Height is the American Forest Foundation's Executive Vice President of American Tree Farm System, Woodlands, and Policy, where she works to increase the Foundation's public policy efforts and build a stronger grassroots network of forest landowners and conservation partners. On the policy front, Rita leads the Forest in the Farm Bill Coalition, co-chairs the Forest Climate Working Group, and is engaged in a number of green building and wood products, tax, and regulatory issues impacting family forest owners. Her previous experience includes serving as a staff member on Capitol Hill and as a policy director for the Society of American Foresters. We welcome Rita.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Really appreciate Jay and Jad's kind of context of, the challenge out there and the opportunity out there to both maintain and enhance this incredible climate mitigation tool we have in our forests. And as Jay really hinted at and Jad talked about, most of the forests in the U.S. are privately owned, and most are owned by families and individuals. There's about 22 million people in the U.S. that own woods. So we've got an opportunity to help those landowners maintain that incredible asset that Jad described and the incredible carbon benefits. But how do we do that? And how can states, and what's that near-term opportunity for states to help address that? And one of the things that we really wanted to focus on today was the Clean Power Plan. So Jad mentioned the Clean Power Plan. It's a rule that the administration has put out to reduce emissions, primarily from the utility industry. And EPA has essentially said in their rule that they want to limit emissions reductions, and those emission reductions limits that they put on states to reductions that are inside the grid, i.e., something that's connected with a utility. But some states may choose to pursue strategies that are outside that grid. And in particular, what we wanted to talk about today is a toolkit that we've developed to help states, really complement those inside the grid emissions reductions with strategies for enhancing and maintaining that forest carbon benefit. And why should states look at this? Why should states consider doing something around forest carbon as they look to implement their work under the Clean Power Plan? Well, first and foremost, I think there's an opportunity for forests and forest carbon to serve as kind of a backstop for emissions reductions. And there's a lot of uncertainty both in, all across the board with the emissions reductions that we're talking about. And forests can help provide that backstop to make sure that, if something fails, there is an additional emissions reductions happening. And then the other thing that, and Jad really hit on this, the continuing, pressure on forests from urbanization and insect and disease and fire risks could mean a deeper, dive from forests, and we might not have that strong sink that we have right now. So the other thing that a state strategy could do is help, avoid deeper reductions in that sink. And the other thing that we won't talk too much about today, but a forest carbon strategy that a state pursues could also complement a state strategy that they want to pursue around biomass energy. So EPA has said that you can use biomass energy as part of the your emissions reductions under the Clean Power Plan, and there's some restrictions around that. But we think that there's a way to complement that biomass strategy with a strategy that works in the woods, to help ensure that we continue to have good forestry happening out there on the ground. So we've developed this toolkit for state governments, and really, if you could go to the next slide, what we've articulated is there's three essential models that a state could pursue to incentivize forest carbon through their state implementation plan under the Clean Power Plan. And those three models are a model of creating essentially a working forest carbon incentives program. And I'll talk about the details on each of these. Another model might be maintaining and enhancing some tax incentives. Tax incentives are a great tool for forest owners to enhance their work on the ground. And the last piece, the last model that a state could pursue, again, these aren't mutually exclusive. You could pursue them all in tandem. Is expanding the use of wood, especially in building construction. So if we could go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about each of these models. So the first, this working forest carbon incentives model. What does this mean? Some of you may be familiar. There's tools out there, as Jay articulated, that provide landowners with incentives, cost share dollars, primarily other incentives to help them implement practices on the ground. These are program models that have been used for a long time. There are programs at the federal level, and there are also state programs. So we think one of the best ways to incentivize forest carbon and help landowners do the management that they need to do on the ground to maintain and enhance forest carbon is using this model that's been successful for quite a while. Create an incentives program that rewards practices for forest carbon and rewards landowners who are interested in putting easements on their property that help permanently protect the forest and keep it as forest. Again, we think this model should be a practice-based approach where you're rewarding a landowner for implementing a practice that has clear carbon benefits. And this is where that state flexibility and that no one-size-fits-all approach really comes in. Because in some states, the best strategies for enhancing and improving carbon on the land might be planting more trees. In other states, it might be, for example, if we're talking about the West, it might be implementing thinning on a piece of property to reduce the fire risk, which ultimately reduces those big carbon emissions from wildfires. So we think working with states, we can help determine what those practices should be for a state and what are the best, what's the best bang for your buck. But again, it should be very much a practice-based approach for rewarding landowners. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is there have been other strategies, in particular forest carbon offset markets, that reward landowners for tons that they add, essentially, additional tons of carbon that they sequester and store. And absolutely, these practices should provide additional carbon benefit. But when you get into kind of rewarding landowners on a ton basis, is you get into a lot of complicated measurement and evaluation that, frankly, for a small landowner, most of the landowners in the country are average acreage size about 50 acres. It's really complicated for them to have to go in and measure and evaluate their forests every year and the added carbon benefit. So we think, again, there's a set of practices that are based on science, science that's been around for a while, that will provide that added carbon benefit that you can reward a landowner for without having to measure ton for ton every single additional carbon ton that you get on the land. The other thing about an incentives model we think is important is having that opportunity for landowners to do short-term contracts, because most landowners have a really hard time committing to long-term contracts. So we're talking 15, 30-year kind of contracts, and then what a state could do is you pool those contracts together, which add up to the emissions reductions that you want to achieve. And again, I talked about the measurement and evaluation efficiency already with using a practice-based approach where on average how much carbon benefit you're getting from a practice and can account for that through an efficient model. And the one thing I'll mention is this isn't a new idea, this forest carbon incentives concept. It's been around for quite a while and was first introduced in some of the cap-and-trade legislation that was underway in Congress back in 2009 and 2010, and was actually included in a couple of the cap-and-trade bills, and there was a chunk of money that was set aside for this flexible carbon incentives model. And Senator Shaheen from New Hampshire has been a leader on this and has reintroduced the bill this year in Congress, which is noted there. So if you could go to the next slide. So again, I mentioned the need to reward landowners on a practice basis, and again, you really need to look at what's most appropriate for your state and the types of practices, and these are just some examples of what some of those practices might look like. And next slide, please. And so you say, okay, great, a carbon incentives model that has that flexibility for a landowner, great, but how do we fund it? And this is just an example that we put up here. A lot of states are looking at their Clean Power Plan and looking at the emissions reductions requirements that they have under the Clean Power Plan. And every state has a set of allowances that EPA has designated for their state to meet their emissions reductions. And we calculate that if a state were to set aside 5% of those allowances, not the whole pot of allowances, a very, very small percentage of allowances that they could auction, sell, whatever model works for the state. If they set that aside for a forest carbon model, these are the kinds of dollars what we would be talking about. So it's significant, but it's a very small portion of those allowances that would need to be set aside to achieve this work, which I think is a good thing in that it's, you get a lot of bang for your buck in doing just a small set aside. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the forest incentives model, kind of a programmatic approach. A state could also pursue a tax model. A lot of the current use taxes that your states have right now do provide incredible forest carbon benefit because they're helping landowners keep their forests as forests, and they're helping them improve their management. Some states have enhanced incentives for additional management actions, et cetera. So you could look at your current use tax program in your state right now and say, are there things that we could do to enhance it? Are there things that we could do to reward landowners who are doing more for carbon, again, using some of those practice models? You could also look at new tax incentives. And again, this could be practice-based, where you could provide a landowner with a credit or a deduction for implementing a certain set of practices on an annual basis. And you could also, a lot of states have already incentives for conservation easements for long-term forest retention. You could also pursue that, which has an incredible forest carbon benefit and helps address that issue that Jad articulated, where we're seeing declines in the sink of forest carbon, and it's largely from urbanization. So if we can find those protections to keep forests as forests, that will really help address one of the big losses of forest carbon. Next slide, please. And then the third model that we think a state could pursue is expanding the use of expanding the use of wood in building construction. So as Jad and Jay both articulated, wood used in buildings especially stores carbon, and it stores it for a long-term period of time. And there are increasing opportunities for building non-residential buildings out of wood, and especially tall wood buildings. There's actually a lot of new technology that's coming online now where you can build 7, 9, in some cases higher story buildings out of wood, and you're replacing the use of steel and concrete, which does have more emissions associated with it. So we think there's an opportunity to do more to build out of wood, which also has all those benefits that we talked about. It helps provide landowners with income so that they can keep their forests as forests and help with that, keeping that sink intact. And it also helps keep those jobs and rural economies that rely on forests and a forest industry growing. So there's a couple ways states could pursue this. One, folks, and it has been very successful, there are programs out there that just increase awareness amongst architects and engineers for using wood in buildings, and it produces pretty significant results in terms of increased wood buildings. So that's one way that a state could pursue this, is just invest in and support that kind of awareness building effort. There are other strategies states could pursue, whether that's putting a carbon preference in their building policy, encouraging the use of life cycle assessment in building construction, so that when you build a building, you have to look at the impact of that building on carbon. And again, wood, because of the carbon storage benefits, as well as the fact that using wood, you're replacing steel and concrete, which has higher emissions, you get both the storage and the substitution benefits there. And then a state could also pursue a tax incentive for low carbon buildings, very similar to the incentives that might be out there for Energy Star or other sort of strategies that are out there. So those are the three models that the Forest Climate Working Group has put together and built in this toolkit that's available online. And essentially, just to refresh, you could pursue an incentives model that provides resources, cost share assistance for landowners to implement practices, both management practices as well as conservation easements, to enhance and maintain that forest carbon sink. And then you could also pursue a tax model. And again, that's kind of very similar to a practice-based approach, where you could provide a landowner with a credit for carbon-friendly management practices. And then lastly, you could pursue strategies to expand the use of wood in building construction, which have also incredible carbon benefits. So with that, I think I've covered all of the policy proposals that states could pursue, and we are looking for some questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Rita, and thank you to all of our speakers. We have several questions that we'll be answering now, but for those that have one pending, please go ahead and type it in the question box. We do have a bit of time, so hopefully we'll be able to get to that. And then I wanted to have one final reminder to folks that the webinar is recorded, and you'll receive a link about how to access a recording and presentations from today very shortly. So I guess moving off of your presentation, Rita, can you or Jad or Jay share some examples of states that are successfully working towards these policy goals or have incorporated some of these policies in their practices?
Sure, we certainly can. A couple of things I would say. So one thing that I'll talk about on the wood products side. So at this point, I don't know. There are a number of states that have strategies to promote awareness of wood products in buildings. But at the federal level, USDA has actually worked pretty hard to get some policies in place to reward the use of wood in building construction. So again, I don't have a state example of that, but there are a lot of examples at the federal level of agencies that have promoted the use of wood. And I'm actually wondering if Jad might talk about how California in particular has pursued kind of a forest carbon incentives model like I articulated that's in our toolkit. Did we lose Jad? Okay, Jad.
Sorry about that. I had muted myself. So let me actually give examples from opposite sides of the country, so we get the kind of underscore that point that there are different approaches that you can customize for different situations. So as you said, Rita, correctly, California, one of the things that California has done with the revenue generated from sale of carbon allowances has been to invest in some of the forest solutions that we talked about. And so, for example, providing funding for a permanent conservation of forests, keeping forests as forests, and also providing funding for carbon beneficial practices like hazardous fuels reduction. And they've done that, importantly, working through existing state agency programs and structures, but essentially adapting them to require that the projects that are being funded show those carbon benefits clearly, and that the things that are being funded are really tailored for carbon benefits. I should also note, by the way, something we haven't talked about too much here today, but is another critical component of the role of forests and carbon reductions is urban forests. I think Jay mentioned it early, and that's something else that California has invested significantly in through its cap and trade funds. And if you think about the carbon benefit of urban forests, it's not just that they sequester a lot more carbon than folks realize, but furthermore, the energy saving benefits of trees in terms of heat island mitigation and how that positively impacts the cooling load in cities during peak periods is a huge energy savings. Actually, about 5 to 10% of energy use for cooling in cities during peak periods is attributable to urban heat islands. So there's a real opportunity for urban forests to advance our carbon goals, and California has invested in that as well. Going to the other side of the country, I happen to be in Vermont today, as a matter of fact, just down the street from the State House, and Vermont has been a particularly successful state on something that Rita talked about, which is current use taxation. Current use taxation has been a very successful strategy that the state has invested here in working with private landowners to provide them a, essentially preferential tax treatment for keeping their forests as forests and for developing a management plan for those forests. So I think actually a number of states have done that, including New England's been a particular hub of that current use activity. But Vermont is one that comes to mind as a state that I think has been particularly successful at getting a lot of landowner enrollment and seeing some really strong benefits from it.
Great, thank you. Another audience question we had is around the forest management practices for approximately the last 50 years, and if those management practices are directly tied to carbon increases from different forest policies and politics, and if those policies are somewhat attributable to carbon increases that we've seen.
This is Rita, and I'm happy to jump in to start. So over the last 50 or so years, we have seen an increase in the amount of forests that are out there. So there has been, if you look across the country nationwide, there's an increase in forests, which means that sink that Jad described is getting stronger. But what we see from the trends is that over the next probably, I guess it's about 30 to 40 years, the Forest Service in particular projects that we'll start to see increasing forest loss. So there is a kind of a dynamic there of we've seen a lot of increased forest, largely from kind of abandoned agricultural land converting back to forest, but the trend is going the other way. And I think there's a couple things that we can point to as why the increase in forest that we've seen and how that has had a great impact on carbon. A couple things. One, the data really shows that in the South in particular, as we've seen increasing forest industry, as we've seen the growth of the industry, we actually get more forests because there's an economic incentive for landowners to grow trees and manage them because of the markets that are there. And there's a couple other things that you can point to as being effective in kind of helping with that forest and helping with forest management. The tax policies that Jad articulated at the state level, there's also a lot of federal tax, not a lot, but a couple of federal tax incentives that have rewarded reforestation and forest management, which has had an impact on forests. So again, I think that ultimately helps add to that sink. And those policies weren't necessarily driven by forest carbon goals, but certainly have, as Jay and Jad both articulated, those kind of forest management practices have a whole range of benefits, including carbon.
Let me throw in a quick thought, and I'm eager to hear if Jay has any thoughts as well. Just to note, one thing that my organization works on is voter-approved finance measures, conservation finance measures, and over the last 20 years, we've been involved in $64 billion worth of voter-approved finance measures, at the state and local level. And so, in terms of state investment in these kinds of solutions, it's really important to point out that, whether it's the LCHIP program, as it's known in New Hampshire, a Land and Community Heritage Investment Program, I think it's called, would be one example from one part of the country. But Washington has a very robust, Washington State has a very robust state level program for investing in forest conservation. I mean, I could just go around the country, and I think that the creation of those programs, and I think the really strategic administration of those programs by states, really being thoughtful about where their forests are at greatest risk of conversion, and really getting into those areas where we're most likely to see major forest loss, and working with landowners on things like conservation easements, keep those lands in private hands but keep them from being converted. The states have been huge investors in that strategy, and I think that's been a very substantial driver of the positive overall positive trends that we've seen in the last 50 years.
And if Jay doesn't want to jump in, the one thing I would say is, all of the stuff that Jad talked about and I talked about as the policies that have been put in place that really help, kind of enhance that forest carbon sink. That's why the policy models that we're suggesting are what we're suggesting, because there are these proven strategies that have worked clearly to keep forests as forests. There are a lot of pressures that are coming down the pike from urbanization, fire, et cetera. And so we think we need to basically amplify those strategies and help states implement more of those strategies because they have been so successful in the past.
And this is Jay Ferrel with NASF. I'll just quickly add that on the private land side, they take different forms in different states, but the general trend towards tax incentive programs, tax credits for reforestation, for managed forests, as opposed to just letting forests sit. Those kinds of trends have been very positive, very productive, very helpful. On the public land side, and you see it on the news, and tragically we'll probably see it on the news again this summer, the catastrophic wildfire situation in the nation has gotten exponentially worse over the last, well, really even the last 10 years, but certainly over the last 50 years, and many drivers for that, but the declining ability of federal lands and really state-owned lands, public lands in general, to actively manage their forest is a contributing factor. Climate change is a contributing factor, insect and disease, but on the public land side there's been some worrisome trends, and that the solution is active forest management, but that's easier said than done.
Thank you all. And then one final question that relates to EPA, that the rules that it had been mentioned earlier. The first, it's a two-part. The first is, do you see the Supreme Court stay of the Clean Power Plan as having an effect on forest policies for carbon storage and sequestration, and then also their draft findings on biomass's carbon neutrality, and what effect do you think that could have in relation to this topic?
I wonder if we can divide and conquer on that question. Should I take the first part, Rita and Jay, and then let the two of you speak about the nuances of the biomass piece?
Sure.
The Forest Climate Working Group, we have an expert Clean Air Act attorney who's kind of helping us follow the bouncing ball and what's happening. And I think that at the simplest level to say, we don't think that the stay and the current activity will have an impact on the potential for forest carbon to be engaged in the rule, assuming that it does move forward. If for some reason it doesn't, and EPA goes back to the drawing board, that might be a different equation. But we think that if this is essentially a temporary delay in the process, because what we're doing is not because some of the strategies that we're advocating aren't necessarily tied to a nuance in the rule. If there are just kind of minor changes that come about as a result of the stay, the kind of connections that we're trying to draw wouldn't really be impacted by the types of changes that you might see if the rule essentially moves forward on a just now slightly delayed timeline. So we are trying to position to provide consulting to interested states kind of on an as-if basis, because we think, furthermore, the last thing I'll say is we think these are no-regret strategies. We think actually that whether they're linked to revenues from the Clean Power Plan or whether they're linked to other kind of revenue strategies in the future, we think there are some ideas and some opportunities here that are really kind of no regrets, and so definitely excited to continue the conversation.
And on the biomass question, I'm happy to jump in, and Jay, please jump in as well. But so as I mentioned, EPA has allowed states under the Clean Power Plan to use biomass to meet their emissions reductions, to essentially use biomass as an energy source. And EPA has put some parameters around what types of biomass can be used, et cetera, and have again qualified those emissions as emissions reductions that can be used under the plan. And from AFF's perspective, we think that that's a good start. I think there's some questions we still have about how EPA has defined biomass and put some of those restrictions on biomass that really, we still have some questions about how they'll really be implemented, and are hoping to work with states to help provide that clarity so that we can have a strong biomass industry that helps meet those emissions reductions, and at the same time we have strategies that can help ensure that we're doing the right thing on the land and continuing to sustainably manage the land.
And excuse me, everybody. This is Jay Ferrel. I apologize. I'm going to have to exit the webinar to conduct another meeting here shortly. But thank you for the opportunity, and happy to answer any questions offline. After the webinar, my contact information is on my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jay. All right, if there are no other responses to that question, we will go ahead and conclude today's webinar. I want to extend another thank you to our 3 speakers today, and thank you to our attendees for participating. As a reminder, a recording and presentation slides will be made available, and you will receive an email shortly about how to access these resources and register for upcoming webinars. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.